Thank you all so much for coming out. I'm going to go without mic right now because I've never been accused of having a soft voice. So I'm going to hope if my back row can hear me okay? Thank you. That's what I wanted to hear. Thank you. I can't thank you enough. I know summer. I'm not going to even go into end of summer yet. I will not accept that fact yet. But that you're coming out during the summer. We're not 110 today, thank goodness, but 101, it'll do. To spend one of your hot dog days of summer with us here at the Texas Language Center. I'm very grateful. My name is Tom Gutsa.
We got people from Iraq. They could care less.
Okay, so I checked with my colleagues down in Morocco, because I said, hey, we're at 110. We're at 42. Where are you? And they said, it's 38 in Morocco. What's wrong? What's wrong with you people in Texas? It's like, but you're right. I think Iraq, I checked Baghdad. 25. Oh, that's ridiculous. I'm moving so your argument doesn't hold. There you go. No, we're about the hottest place in the planet right now. So welcome. But by the way, just so you all know, global warming is a myth. Okay, it does not exist. The fact that it's never been 110 in Austin is a myth. So, thank you even more so. Thank you, Orlando, for making it patently clear that it's really freaking hot here. But thank you for spending this day with us. We're trying to make the day shorter than usual, just precisely because it's hot, so we want to try to finish it. We will finish at 3 o'clock today to get you out before it gets really, really hot. And in order to do that, normally we'll give these elaborate introductions that I always embarrass Carl giving them too long. I'm going to keep the introductions for our speakers very short and sweet today so we can really spend time on the material. I did want to say 2 words first about the format of what we're doing today. There are 4 of us presenting in this kind of a retrospective, prospective of what has happened in the last decades that has we think, has really impacted what we do in world language classrooms. And specifically, we're taking this kind of jocular notion of then and now, but we're really looking at what happened before that's, in a sense, informed and made possible what we're doing today that we think has not just potential, but is actually doing the kinds of things in everything from actual language teaching to textbook production or not, and putting materials out there, creating new materials using different kinds of technology. So hopefully you're going to find these comments not just ruefully reminiscent of, oh yes, that's how I learned language. Most of you are way younger than I am. That's terrible. But it's not just about remembering how things were, but really how did we get to here from there? That's the focus really of what we'd like to do today. So we're trying to keep it all short and sweet for you today. We normally have breaks built in. Obviously, we'll break for lunch at checking the schedule 12:15. But instead of having the usual kind of what do you call them, accommodation breaks, pardon me, we're just going to encourage individuals, if you need to take a break, the facilities, there are men's facilities, women's facilities, and gender-neutral facilities just out the door to the left when you go outside the door. So please feel free. None of the speakers will take it amiss if you need just to step out for a few minutes, come and go as you need. Same thing with refreshments. If you'd like to recharge your water or coffee or tea, please just help yourself while we talk. We'll keep it rather informal today. Yeah? I thank, as always, she's not here to hear the thanks, but I want to put them out anyway to our associate. This is our associate both in Coral, the Center for Open Education Resources and Language Learning, and the Texas Language Center, to Betsy Brown, who does simply yeoman service in our centers, keeping projects like this running. So yeah, Betsy, it's for you, yes. Thank you. Well, it's on tape, we're good. She'll be able to see it later. Okay, so without further ado, as I said, I want to really keep us on schedule so we can spend as much time as possible on our topics. The first one, the speakers today, as I said, we really did look at what kinds of things are going on at UT that are, in a sense, creations of new ways of doing things that are based on what has gone on in the past. And no one, I thought, could start us off better than our director of Coral, the Center for Open Education Resources and Language Learning, than its director, Carl Blyth. He comes to us from the Department of French and Italian, where he still does do, yes, the good teaching of French, but also now is very much involved in looking at, as his title suggests today, and I'll put that up in just a second here, from communicative language teaching to multi-literacies, now work in the different ways in which we both interpret and perform speech acts. So without further ado, let me introduce to you the director of choral, Carl Blyth. Let me just swap you out here. All right. Do you want to use a mic, by the way?
I can project, I don't need to.
It's here if you need it. Okay. Yeah. Their voice goes.
All right.
Perfect. Thank you.
Tom, can I ask you a question?
Yes.
So, this is on me, this is.
Yes.
The icons are different. Oh, here it is in the bottom.
It's down at the slideshow. There it is. So that's what they're saying. And so you can see what's coming up. That's what they're saying. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, thanks Tom for that.
We can see
Thanks for the introduction, and thank you guys for showing up today. And a special thanks to our scholars from Iraq. We had a large group last year of Fulbright Scholars, and they were incredibly passionate about language learning and really had a lot to offer us here in the United States. So I'm really excited that we have another team back again this year, so we keep this exchange going on. So the title, I made a little tiny tweak. You always have to play with the title. It's from communicative language teaching to multi-literacies pedagogy. So I wanted to make sure that I have the pedagogy here instead of just the concept of multi-literacies. And I noticed in the blurb for this workshop that it was to be practical and give you some ideas for you to take back into classrooms. This won't be so practical in the sense that what I really intend to do here is set the frame for today's discussion and trace, I think, a couple of big trends that are going on and ideas that hopefully will then become more practical during the day. We'll talk about that. And I also see that what I'm trying to do here, I have an hour, but I really don't want to talk that long. I want to be provocative and get you guys to talk. So that's what I'm trying to do here, setting the frame. So let me start with this book. I'm going to be citing a lot of books so that you can go back and read them and whatever, but this book came out in 2003. It's called Reading Between the Lines, Perspectives on Foreign Language Literacy. And I'll be talking about the concept of literacy a lot, which is a new term that came in. We didn't talk about literacy in the 1990s, but it's all over the place nowadays. And there was an article, a chapter actually in this book by Richard Kern, or Rick Kern to his friends. Rick Kern was a professor here at UT in the French department, French and Italian, and now he has been, he left us in the mid-90s and went to Berkeley. He's been at Berkeley ever since. But he wrote this article called Literacy as a New Organizing Principle for Foreign Language Education. And in that chapter, he kind of traces very quickly different trends in foreign language teaching, going all the way back to grammar translation. I don't have to go through all of that because I'm sure that you are very well aware of that. And then what happened in the 1980s, the movement towards communicative language teaching. But he summarized it, I think, really nicely by thinking that grammar translation emphasized the concept of knowing, knowledge, abstract knowledge about a language system, and then opposed to communicative language teaching that placed a greater emphasis on actually doing something with the language. So communication is doing. Grammar translation was about usage, meaning prescriptive language rules. What is the correct way to use the language? We were describing the system. As opposed to a descriptive approach, let's just have people communicate, and people don't always, and when they communicate, they break the rules. So let's move to a more descriptive approach. Grammar translation is focused on form, a big shift to the function of language. And all of this follows together. Grammatical syllabus, that's what we did. What did we teach? We taught a grammatical syllabus. And then in the 80s, people started talking about a functional syllabus. If we actually think about language in terms of what we do with it, maybe let's flip the script and start not with forms, but with functions. And then finally, what this really ended up doing was giving us a knowledge about language, not necessarily the ability to communicate. Okay, so that's a real quick 40 years. That's probably very familiar territory to everybody. And by the way, let me ask a real quick question. What do you teach? Kira, what do you teach?
I'm teaching 2 students that we brought with us today. So I'm teaching, we've got a new master's in TESOL, so we're teaching them how to teach
Oh, okay.
a foreign language, but this one's going to be English as a foreign language, but you know, and for those of y'all who have no way of knowing, Carl was a co-director of my dissertation here, and so I taught French here. I still continue to teach French, but I also teach Spanish as a foreign language.
So that's a complicated question. I was hoping that you would give me a really short, but that's good. That's good. You gave me
A little blurb, so
lot
some
of
things that people can bounce off of.
Okay, so what does she teach? She teaches, you teach, like, if you had to put that into...
I teach the language itself as a foreign language,
Okay,
but I'm also teaching teachers
okay, so you teach
to
methodology,
teach
or
a
you
foreign
teach...
language.
Right, okay, good. What do you teach?
Spanish.
Spanish.
There's a
That's usually what I get. That's usually, and if I go around the room, people will say Czech back there and Latin back there. We have different languages. So in a nutshell, where I'm going to go with this today, give it all away, is the grammar translation was about the answer to the question, what do you teach? And people would respond with one word, which is the language. I'm going to give you another word which I think is more appropriate to the zeitgeist of what people are talking about today, and that's language culture. It's a neologism that's been around in anthropological linguistics for quite a long time, and it's starting to make a whole lot of sense, but we'll talk about that neologism, that blend. Because we do more than teach language, certainly more than what we've been teaching for many, many years, more than structures. Okay, so in that article, or that chapter by Rick Kern that I cited earlier, he has this quote: "Communicative language teaching is based on the idea that learning language successfully comes through having to communicate real meaning." I put that in red, right? That's not him. "When learners are involved in real communication, their natural strategies for language acquisition will be used, and this will allow them to learn to use the language." So, the implication is that somehow grammar translation, what we used to be doing, wasn't real language. It was somehow artificial. Now, since I'm talking about trends and the evolution, and just as Karen said, one of my former students, I've been here a while, and when Karen was here, I was teaching a kind of a methods course, an applied linguistics course, and the book I used in 1996-97 was this, Making Communicative Language Teaching Happen by Jim Lee and Bill Van Patten. They're 2 names that many of you are familiar with, especially in Spanish. I wanted to make communicative language teaching happen, so I adopted this book. In the book, Lee and Van Patten describe language from a functional perspective, and they basically, and there are many different approaches to this, but they boiled it down to 2 basic approaches. And that is, we use language functionally for what they called social reasons, psychosocial reasons, or they defined it, the other kind of function was cognitive information. Now, we can argue about the titles, but the idea essentially is, you know, this diagram here, this image is meant to, we're transferring some kind of a message, some kind of information to somebody else. That information usually is literal meaning, referential meaning about something in the world. As opposed to this, where the meaning perhaps isn't terribly important. The idea is just to get the other person to laugh. We're playing with language. Here, the point of using language is to affiliate, social bonding, something like that. Here, it may be more to construe a message and then get that message across. So it's more informational in that sense. So what they did in this book, which I completely disagree with now, they said that language teaching is really better for this kind of approach, meaning that we should structure our classes for transferring information across, right? And truth conditional information that was right or wrong. And not so much this stuff. Language for bonding, language for affiliation, language for play, Not really. Language classrooms shouldn't really do that. Okay, so I started typing in, doing a Google search on communicative language teaching, or ESL. I thought was thinking I needed to give an example for that people would understand, so I chose English. And this popped up. It was one of many, so there are lots of readings, and this came from a communicative course in English. Thanksgiving. Thanksgiving is celebrated in the USA and Canada. The USA it's celebrated on the fourth Thursday in November every year. The Canadians celebrate it on the second Monday in October. It is associated with. Okay, so this is what Lee and Van Patten are talking about. This is conveying information. And we can, if you understand, notice these kinds of readings are always followed by comprehension checks, which are truth conditional. There's a right and a wrong answer. Okay? So this was communicative, but the notion of communication is highly constrained, right? That's the main point. This shouldn't be disorienting to anybody. You've seen things like this, right? Okay, so then this book was actually published in 2000, which I think was an important, very important publication, Literacy and Language Teaching. And Rick Kern dropped the concept of foreign and was just talking about language in general here. So as I talk about literacy throughout this talk, it's not just for L2, it's not just for second language learners, but also applies to first language learners. And in this book, he doubled down on everything that he was saying and explained literacy as this new organizing principle. So here he says, you know, literacy, the concept that we need about, that has been around for a long time, is you want to do something with language, but importantly, we want to add on this piece of self-reflection. We want people to be more aware of how they're using language. So it's not just knowledge about language, it's this kind of self-referential, taking a step back and thinking, how did I just interact with that person, and how did that person interact with me? Might there be cultural differences in layers and layers and layers of meaning? It's not just prescriptive versus descriptive, it's actually the relationship of both, usage and use. We need to think about relationships also between the forms and the functions. So you can see he's trying to put these things back together. And then importantly, then part of the enterprise was to think about appropriateness, which brings up cultural background and metalinguistic awareness. So he adds things to what language teachers were doing. And here's a picture of Rick. Again, he was here at UT many years ago. And part of the discussion around literacy then led into a discussion, particularly in higher education, about the model of the bifurcated language program. It became known as bifurcated foreign language. We tend to talk about lower division and upper division. That's reified here in our catalog at the University of Texas, and I found it everywhere else I taught in the United States. So this is all going to be very recognizable to you. So lower division takes care of the functional communicative needs, and it's focused on everyday language. Whereas upper division, it's more focused on analytical critical skills for academic needs. And that breaks down into what kinds of language genres you look at. So here, of course, let's jump to there were non-literary texts, weather reports, menus, whatever, generally literary or cultural texts. We talk about these courses are focused on language, these courses are focused on content, on and on. And then, of course, they're very different in the interactions that take place, so small group interaction versus still largely lecture or what I would call monologic discourse, so one person talking at a time and everybody else listening. Okay? This is a problem. And it's a problem that even though we're shifting methodologies, we haven't been able to overcome. Does this look familiar? Right? What I've just described, the bifurcated model. Okay. So again, I'm tracing this historical development in the field. This was a paper, the MLA report on foreign languages, which was published in 2007 and entitled Foreign Languages in Higher Education, New Structures for a Changed World. And they basically, it's a very short paper, it's a position paper. It was a task force that was put together by the MLA, people and representing different disciplines within our own field. So there were people in literature, or culture studies, people, very well-known people, by the way, as well as applied linguistics and language teaching. And basically they argue against, obviously, this notion of a bifurcated model. They say we need to integrate it. We've been talking about integration for years. So content from the beginning and language to the end is how it's expressed. But they also said that the reason for training people in foreign languages was essentially this. This was the goal, and they articulated it, and I think, in a new way. This was 2007, by the way, so they were brought together as a group in 2003, 2004, and it took them a while to come to this document and then publication, so it takes a while for these things to work out. But I should also frame this before we get into what the goal was. What happened in 2001? A very huge historical event in the United States, which changed things for many people. Right, 9/11 happened, and suddenly people started thinking the world in pre-9/11 and post-9/11. What they really talk about in this paper is that the world has changed, and we now need to think about things in a multilingual, multicultural world. There's something called the internet. There's the rise of global technology. We have contact in a way that we've never had before in human history. And that should have a huge impact on the way we're teaching foreign languages. We can't continue to do languages in bubbles. Languages are now in contact, massive contact with each other. So we have the internet, we have incredible migration, there are movements of people, there are problems with immigration, wars and famine and so forth, so people are on the move all around the world. And so they started talking about this, and there's something new that's happened. It was certainly a kind of a moment where they became aware of it. And so here they finally give this new goal for language learning. Language majors should be structured to produce a specific outcome, translingual and transcultural competence, and the language, the language they're learning, and in English. Advanced language learning often is assessed against an implicit norm, the competence of an educated native speaker, a goal that post-adolescent learners rarely fulfill. So, they were also rejecting explicitly the native speaker norm. No, the native speaker is not what we should be aiming for. So what should we be aiming for? They talk about it in terms of multilingual. We are training people to become multilinguals. What does that mean? Okay. In contrast, so the idea of TTC, in contrast, places value on multilingual ability to operate between languages, and that italics was in the original. So the trans, of course, meaning moving back and forth between cultures and languages, and to do that with some kind of awareness. I'm now speaking from an American perspective, I'm now speaking from a French perspective. Students are educated to function as informed and capable interlocutors with educated native speakers in a target language. They also learn to reflect on the world and themselves through another language and culture. Again, we keep expanding things or raising the bar, whatever metaphor you like, but this was significant, and people were thinking, I'm supposed to do that in beginning French classes? I'm not sure how to do that. Okay, so as I said at the very beginning, what I think the shift is really about, I'm going to boil it down to this concept of when you say I teach Spanish, that's not wrong, but you want to say more, I teach Spanish language culture. So let's take a minute to, what does that mean, this concept, which again has been around for quite a while. It's a neologism that has been used in different terms, lingual culture, it exists in other languages, langue culture in French, which has been around since the 80s in citations in many different languages. So look, I'm awkward when people compliment me. Nice hair. Oh, thanks, I grew it myself. So this, of course, is just a silly thing to talk about compliments and compliment responses, which is highly cultural, right? In American English, and again, now we're not just talking about language, we're talking about language always in the cultural context. In American English, there is the unmarked norm. The typical way you respond to a compliment is by saying thank you. And I have witnessed people who don't say thank you and who push back a little bit, and the interlocutor will say, you need to learn how to take a compliment. I see people shaking their heads. Okay, so this is very much ingrained in how we are supposed to do language, how we're supposed to do compliments. Years ago, I was on a committee. A graduate student it was a fascinating project in applied linguistics. She was looking at it was really on compliment responses, so this part of it. How do you respond to a compliment? And she was Japanese, and she was looking at Japanese native speakers and American English speakers. And that pretty much summarized what the Americans did. Not that part, that's weird, right? But the thanks. Oh, thanks. You like my hair, thank you. But so there was one, she developed this really interesting little design. She gave people pictures, and they talked about their families. And I remember one Japanese woman was describing her son. She was obviously proud of her son, who was at an Ivy League institution and was in science, and I think it was chemistry. And so the person said, wow, your son must be very intelligent. Compliment. Oh no, he's actually quite stupid. So the point is, it's really, and all the responses were like that. The Japanese had to take the compliment and dismiss it, diminish it, push it down, mitigate it, do something like that. So these were obvious patterns. This, of course, is called a speech act, right, in linguistic terms and pragmatics. But language culture exists at all the different levels of language, because language, of course, is a cultural tool. The words you choose to describe an event will be culturally based. The event itself, how you conceptualize the event, and on and on and on. Okay. Here, I just came back from 2 months in France and leading a study abroad program, and this book came out. It's a really nice little book for kind of baby sociolinguistics and raising some of these issues to our students. It's written by a Canadian couple, an English-speaking Canadian and a French-speaking Canadian. They're married, both of them bilingual, but the important point of language culture is they're Canadian. They're not French. They speak the French language, but they're not French. And so when they went to France, they realized, oh my goodness, the French are different than we are. I mean, I can communicate, but I'm having all kinds of issues. And they lead this book, they begin this book, and the reason why they call it the Bonjour effect, it's in a chapter entitled, I Greet, Therefore I Am, the importance of greetings. And they said that, they give this anecdote, they were all getting on as a family, they had 2 little kids, and the bus driver, and they're doing their transaction, getting the bus ticket, and the bus driver says, aloud, mal élevé, poorly raised. And so, again, this French speaker who did the transaction in French, they sat down and go, why did they think he was so poorly raised? Because they had not said bonjour, they had not said hello. So, in this past summer, I did a little experiment, a little kind of ethnographic experiment with my students. I said, I want you to pay attention to greetings. And also, you can see how things go if you don't say bonjour. Even going up to buy a metro ticket, which is very transactional. I went to a movie the other day here in Austin, and I stood in line. I guess I'm a creeper. I like to watch people use language. I'm sitting there listening to people. Very few Americans said hello. There was no greeting at all. The unmarked natural way then to do transactional language is to just say, I need 2 tickets to this movie, okay? But not in France. You say bonjour. And then, because what I told the students, what they say here is essentially, you go into a space, and a French person's already inhabiting the space, and they have a function to perform. And you need to say, hello, I am a human being, and you are a human being. I recognize you have this function. I respect you for that function. Now let's perform the function. Okay? And all of that has already been done in an American's mind, but not in French mind. Okay, so this is this obvious notion of language culture. So let's shift to multiliteracy's pedagogy. And I gave this as an image. because I think this captures some of the importance of translingual, transcultural competence, because here it's really the ability to communicate across cultures or within this intercultural framework. So let me give you another example. 10 years ago, I don't normally teach lower division language classes, but I was teaching a fourth semester language class and doing an activity that was, I suppose, communicative. So the students were talking about the weekend, or it was basically an activity to get them to practice past tenses, but we'll call it communicative. And I heard two guys in the front of the room talking about a football game, a UT football game. What else are they going to talk about? They're UT students. And it turns out that football is really a big thing here in Texas. So I just kind of was listening to them and I thought, this is really weird. These two guys are speaking about American football in French. Okay, that's the weirdness of a communicative language teaching classroom. But so all of a sudden, one of the guys turns to me and says, "Comment dit-on cheerleader?" How do you say cheerleader? And I thought, okay, this is a teachable moment, right? And I said, bah, ça se dit pas. Les cheerleaders, ça n'existe pas en France. He said, it doesn't exist. You can't say that. And he looked at me like, what? I mean, I'm playing the game. You gave me this stupid assignment. I'm talking about a football game. We're communicating. And I could see that he was really puzzled. So I said, okay. I switched into English and said, it's not something that they would say in France. He said, well, I'm not in France. I said, you're right. And I said, well, you could explain to him what a cheerleader is. Use a circumlocution. I'm still trying it. He looked at us, well, he knows what a cheerleader is. I said, okay, you get the problem. That's essentially the problem, that we're trying to teach language that's culturally embedded in a context that isn't, so how do we do that? And multiliteracy's pedagogy takes as a premise that all language is a cultural artifact, therefore culture has to be present. You don't just teach language, you teach language culture. So this is where it gets real. And this is an obvious cultural interaction, intercultural interaction. Japanese people can dress in Western fashion, but this is a very particular situated, let's say, use of language, or what we would call situated practice in more kind of anthropological terms. Does anybody recognize what this is? Yeah, it's a tea ceremony, which is highly ritualized. This is a geisha girl, and she's the one who is kind of leading him through this. So we need to know how to act in this situation. So multiliteracy gives us, it's a new way of talking about language. And it's been developed by a group. It started in the 90s. And it's an interesting movement because it borrows from different disciplines: anthropological linguistics, as I mentioned, sociolinguistics, literacy. And they don't talk about grammar per se, they talk about designs. And the reason they use the word design, so the ritual, the tea ceremony,